And we're now going on to Andreas Lammer, who is junior professor at the University of Trier and will be known to a lot of you already through his fantastic award-winning book on Avicenna's physics. And he's going to be telling us more about matter and the Islamic philosophical tradition. So take it away, Andy.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also thanks, Emma, for mentioning a couple of things that I will also be mentioning later. And also, of course, thanks to Nicola for keeping us here for a couple of years every few weeks on screen on Friday evenings. I think it's a great venture, so don't take this the wrong way. The reason why I'm talking about Avicenna and Avicenna Latinus, and I'm already sharing my screen, right? You see that? Good. The reason why I'm talking about Avicenna and Avicenna Latinus is that I've realized something, but it's not something very big or mind-blowing, but still, I think, something crucial. The study of Avicenna used to be in the hands of medieval Latinists. Certainly in the 20th century, only a very small specialized group of people worked from and translated Arabic texts. There's nothing bad about this situation, but it is important to take note of it. Sometimes when reading articles of said medieval Latinists, one could occasionally read something like the following, which stems from Carlos Steele's wonderful article, Avicenna and Thomas Aquinas on Evil. He writes there, "What is it that is so interesting about this chapter, Avicenna's chapter on evil in his metaphysics, that led Thomas to use it as the main source for his presentation of his own view of evil? Not knowing Arabic myself, I, like Thomas, rely on the Latin translation made from the Shifa. I'm aware that this is a serious limitation and that I run the risk of misreading what Avicenna actually said, of interpreting only the Avicenna Latinus." Carlos Steele's article is from 2002. That is still quite recent, but still almost 20 years ago. And times have changed a little bit, as the very small specialized group of people working from and translating Arabic texts, to which I just referred, has grown. Not so much, but relatively much. And the result is that more and more people are working on Avicenna by investigating Arabic texts and or reading modern translations of Arabic texts, because there are more translations. And one should also not forget Avicenna's Persian work and its translations. A sign of this is that in the past 3 years, no less than 14 monographs have appeared on Avicenna's thought and influence. And maybe I missed some, 13. 14 even. That is a large number and a couple of kilograms worth of insights. However, and now comes the point which I have realized, and I again want to stress it's not very big a revelation. The recent results of scholars on Avicenna are not or may not immediately and directly be relevant for the study of medieval Latin philosophy. Why? Well, because as Carlos remarked, there's always at least the danger of differences between Avicenna and Avicenna Latinus. Thus, every publication of Avicenna should be followed by a subsequent publication investigating whether all these interesting insights into Avicenna's thought and philosophy, as it is expressed in his Arabic works, are applicable to the Avicenna Latinus as well. One example, I'm almost certain that Avicenna's ideas are behind many some 13th century Latin treatises on time, but I simply cannot and should not jump from what I think to have understood about his Arabic works on time to any statement about his Latin influence about time, because if all those fine distinctions that I see in his Arabic works were lost or got lost in translation, then what I think I see in these Latin texts might not be Avicennian. And what I would have to find out is whether they are still Avicenna Latinian. So when Nicola asked me to contribute to this wonderful journey, and at the end of last year, when I agreed to contribute, this section was still called Islamicat Philosophy into Latin and not Islamicat Roots, as it is now called. So back then I decided, in the line of the title of this panel today, to compare Avicenna with his Latin self on matter. I admit, and I need to warn you, that this is a somewhat dull exercise because I basically merely posed the question, is the conception of matter by Avicenna Arabus the same as the conception of matter by Avicenna Latinus? And questions of this sort are prone to receive a yes or no answer and are thus in danger of being quite boring. Still, I think, as just mentioned, this is an important exercise, and we probably should have such an exercise, dull or not, whenever a new piece of scholarship appears on Avicenna Arabus. So now you know what I'm up to, and I will show outline basically bit by bit some central themes of Avicenna's thoughts on prime matter. And I follow up his ideas through his Latin works to see what of his thought can be found there. One piece of warning, not everything Avicenna wrote was translated. It's clear, and I mean, for that very reason, it's clear that whatever reached Europe in Latin translation was already an eclectic selection. Not necessarily a bad one, but on some topics, Avicenna is clearer in other works than those that have been translated. And prime matter is no excuse in this regard. And for what was available, I can only direct you to Charles's table in Pasnau's and Van Dyck's Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy, which has it nicely drawn out. And maybe a super final warning, I would like to emphasize that this will not, for me, be an exercise to judge and or to condemn the Latin translators for the mistakes they might have made. I think the Latin translators are fantastic, and I take my hat off to those wonderful scholars and congratulate them for their achievements, no matter what the result of this following exercise. So I think you all have the Latin on the handout, because I passed around a PDF and Nicola was so kind to send it to all your inboxes. So on the handout, you find the Latin translations. I will have English translations on my slides, which I'm sharing on your screens. And these translations are from the Arabic. So basically you can compare the Latin on the handout with the Arabic on screen. And a double slash in the Latin shows where the text breaks on my slides when the slide was too long for one slide and I had to had it let go on the next slide. And I will talk after this introduction about prime terminology first, then prime matter as substance, then the existence of prime matter, then matter and the cosmos in terms of communality. What this is, I will explain. Then about origination, matter and its properties, and matter and potentiality. There's also not really a conclusion at the end of this paper, I'm afraid. My presentation is more like a survey, but we can, I think, discuss our impressions immediately afterwards. Okay, let's begin with terminology. This quote, or this passage from Avicenna is also quoted by Gundi Salvi, and Nicola discusses this as one of his articles as well. Avicenna, in the second chapter of book 1 of the Physics, distinguishes a couple of terms in a rather straightforward manner. They are philosophically not that interesting, but it's always good to clarify terminology, I think. The first term he mentions is hyle. You have the Latin, as I said, on the handout, and here it's transliterated as hyula in the Arabic text. Hyula, of course, comes from the Greek hyle. Another word that Avicenna uses here is mada. We also had this in Emma's presentation already, which is very common for matter. Personally, I would think prime matter can be expressed either by hyula or by mada, by both. This is why I kept them in my translations untranslated so that you know which term was used. There's no reasonable difference in Avicenna's use of the word. Some have claimed that there is, either for Avicenna and for some predecessors of Avicenna, but I'm not convinced that there is really a distinction so easily to be made between these terms. Another term Avicenna defines here or refers to is maudu in Arabic, subjectum in Latin, and gina, we had that in Emma's talk just a few minutes ago, which comes out in Latin as massa, and which is often used as a unrefined stuff as well, or a reference to the ekmageion that we love from Plato. Other terms that he mentions here are the element, ostokus, the Arabic loanword from stocheion in Greek, and onsur, which is translated here as origo, for reasons that become clear when you read or when you've read the text, because he basically represents two kinds of elements. There is a different direction. You get composition when you start from the unsur to the composite, from the origo to the composite. This is why probably the Latin translator chose origo. But you have an analysis when you go from the composite to the element, to the ostokus. So it's a different point of direction. One is a composition from the building blocks to the whole. The other is an analysis from the whole to its building blocks. and one gives you unsur, the other gives you usticus. Apart from this, I agree with Emma fully that unsur very often appears simply as a term for prime matter. And we find, I think, also in Avicenna, al unsur al awal, so the first, also prime matter literally, but not with the terminology of Hyula or of Mada. Another reason why I use this, this first section on terminology is that this reminds me very much of how elements are defined in Hermann of Carinthia and William of Conches. We had this last session nicely. You all remember that Hermann states that que vero in compositione prima e adem in resolutione ultima. And William writes, elementum est quod in constitutione corporis invenitur primum in resolutionem prostremum. So that when I've read that for the first time, I was somehow reminded of Avicenna. Charles beautifully outlined the Arabic background, especially of Hermann's text, and pointed to the medical tradition in Salerno and the astronomical tradition in Al-Andalus. Especially the former, the medical tradition, through references to Galen might be an interesting case, because in the Alexandrian epitomes of Galen that were translated by Walbridge from Arabic into English a couple of years ago, there's a very similar passage about the element as well. And I always wondered if Hermann's or William's phrase could be traced either to Avicenna or to a more common source. I would be very interested in your thoughts about this, because I don't have an answer, and Nicola already mentioned to me it would be very, it would be very interesting if somebody comes out of this. Okay, next, prime matter for Avicenna is actually a substance alongside 4 other substances, which is form, of course, the compound, soul, and intellect. This whole series of lectures refers to the substrate. This is, and another term that comes to mind is subject. So which one do we use when we refer to matter? Avicenna just said in text 1, hyle non est subjectum ex hoc intellectu ullo modo. And that already indicates an important point for his conception of matter. And for this, I need to refer to Aristotle now a bit. What Aristotle does in Physics 1 was to look for the hypokeimenon as one of the 2 or 3 principles of natural things. So the question is matter a hypokeimenon, a subject, if hypokeimenon should be translated as subject? And there's already an ancient worry lurking behind here, that if matter is a subject, then form may perhaps not be a substance, because substances better not exist in subjects. That's precisely the point about a substance. So if matter is a subject and form is in matter, then form is perhaps not a substance, and that's probably quite bad for medieval metaphysics. The key to this solution on from Avicenna's perspective is this here in text 3, it quod est non in subjecto est it quod vocatur substantia. So anything that is not in a subject is a substance. Matter, of course, is not in a subject, so it is a substance. Form is in matter, but matter is not a subject. And so form can be substance too. Why is matter not a subject, you may ask? In text 4, he makes a distinction between substrate, in Arabic mahal, in Latin it in quo aliquid est, and subject, in Arabic maudur, which is subjectum. Interestingly, the Latin shifts for substrate from it in qui aliquid est to materia subjecta, especially after having introduced the term in a clause that has no correspondent in the Arabic, which is indicated by the angled brackets later on. I think whenever I have angled brackets, there's something missing in the Arabic, but it's in the Latin. So what is the distinction between subject and substrate? Subjects do exist by themselves, whereas substrates do not. Matter needs form to be rendered subsistent, and form needs matter too. So maybe we would think that not existing separately by itself would be something that prevents matter from being a substance, but that's not what Avicenna thinks, where he argues that both form and matter are substances, basically for the same reason neither of them is in a subject. And this is the core of the definition of substance here. So both form and matter can be substances. Indwelling does not keep form from being a substance just because it is, indwelling, dwells in matter as a substrate. And aside here, maybe this is very much, all this distinction in Avicenna is very much inspired by late ancient discussions about the definition of substance, of course, and also the ontological status of the specific difference as either substance or accident. And Aristotle's own wording that refers to what exists in something else as a part helped Avicenna for this distinction, because matter and form, they are the parts of the composite, and this is why they can be substances, because they are not in a subject. But this is a very complicated discussion, and I can refer you to Fyodor Benevich's wonderful article on fire and heat, which outlines the late ancient and the Arabic discussion on the definition of the specific difference. Interestingly, as a second aside, the same worry that is pertinent about form also plagues Avicenna, of course, about soul, because soul also seems to exist in the body. And if the body already is a substance and then hence a subject for soul, then soul might not be a substance. And this led to Avicenna's really wonderful elaboration in the first chapter 1 and 1.1 and 1.3 of his Kitab an-Nafs about the status of the soul and how we should define the soul. Basically, the clearest statement of Avicenna on the status of matter then is text 5, where he explicitly refers to substantia hyle and refers to substantialitas enim quam habet. So matter is explicitly attributed with substantiality, or is said to have a substance, or to be a substance. Okay. Next point, existence of prime matter. One of the most interesting features of Avicenna's discussion of matter is his proof for the existence of prime matter. And I think we all know from Aristotle and Plato how difficult it is to prove prime matter by compelling reasoning and not only by bastard reasoning. Avicenna formulated the proof for prime matter in several of his works. And one formulation, though not the clearest one, in my opinion, is in his Metaphysics that was translated into Latin. And this is text 6. The proof runs basically on two questions. What is the principle of corporeal continuity? And on the other hand, what happens when something is divided? And his thought is along the following lines: if body was already continuously extended by itself, then it itself would be also the principle of its continuity, because there's nothing else that explains the continuity of body. So body would explain its own continuity. However, since division is actually not a case of an accidental change, as we might think, because we could say division is a change of quantity. No, it's a substantial change. One whole thing ceases to be, and two half things come to be. If we divide a block of wood into two halves, we destroy that block of wood, and two new halves of it come to be. So if the body was itself extended continuously, it would simply cease to be and vanish if we divide it. And no two other things could come to be unless there is some underlying substrate. While it is body that is divided, it is matter that receives the forms that give rise to bodies. And if you divide a block of wood into two halves, the one form vanishes and two new forms come to be. Hence, if we understand that body is if we understand what body is and what continuity means, we need something that underlies the continuity if we want to understand what division is. This is Avicenna's reasoning, and this thing is matter. The Latin conclusion: in corporibus est aliquid quod est subjectum continuationem. In all this, Avicenna has not mentioned matter. Matter is only mentioned at the end of a subsequent argument, and I'm always a bit worried or asking myself if it's the continuation of the earlier argument or if it's a separate argument. In the Islamic tradition, up to modernity, it's usually in the subsequent Islamic tradition up to modernity, it's usually treated as a separate argument. But at what I want to refer to is its end, where Avicenna finally mentions matter, prime matter. So it's clear what he was talking about in the earlier argument as well. So he wants to establish prime matter with this argument. The next point would be matter and the cosmos. Avicenna distinguishes two kinds of commonality and discusses in which way the four causes are common to all natural things. He distinguishes numerical commonality and generic commonality. So numerical commonality is if it's numerically one and the same, and generic commonality is what you refer to when it's the same in kind. And I think we had this also 2 sessions ago already in one of the previous talks. I had a note on my papers about this. It was, I think, called numerical identity and generic identity in that talk. And to refer as an example, the efficient cause. Every natural body has efficient causes, which are generically alike insofar as they are efficient causes, but all natural things, in addition, share in one and the same big efficient cause, which is God. So with efficient causes, natural bodies have both kinds of efficient causes, the numerically common, which is God, and the generically common, which is, all the efficient causes that enact natural bodies. Avicenna then switches to another question by asking the same about form and matter, whether form and matter are only generically common or also numerically common. And since we are concerned with matter, he asks, is there one and the same big amount of matter that all natural things share in at the same time, or are there numerically different but generically identical matters? It's a bit difficult for me to make sense of a single and numerically one matter for all things. So why does he ask the question at all? Because it seems to be a strange case. One idea I had was the more impassive matter is, and the less it is actually affected by form, the more it remains one and the same, irrespective of the multiplicity of natural things. For example, if we think that in Plotinus, for example, matter remains entirely unaffected by a mere indwelling of form, then yes, perhaps here we have a numerically one matter for all things. The same perhaps could be applied to Plato, whatever you think his position about space and matter is. If it's not affected and the things just appear in it, then it might be one and the same numerically one matter that we all, as natural beings, we are share in. And it's not just generically common. A second remark, it is clear that whatever is not generically one can also not be numerically one. So if we prove a generic difference, this also proves a numerical difference. I think this is quite clear. And this explains why Avicenna answers the question about a potential numerical identity of matter in the cosmos by an argument aiming at generic identity. He asks, do the supralunary and the sublunary bodies have the same kind of matter? He seems to deny this here in text 8. First, he continues saying that matter is certainly generically common. So he first denies it. Then he says maybe matter is generically common to all sublunary things that he accepts. And the differences that arise not from a difference in matter, but in a difference in form. And then he says on the next slide, maybe that applies to the heavens compared to the earth too. So that the incorruptibility of the heavens may not be due to matter, but due to form. And then, of course, there could be, in principle, a numerically identical matter as well. I think it's clear, as we will see soon, that Avicenna does not think that matter is numerically one throughout the cosmos. Yet what he describes here about form and matter, about its relation, is actually what he thinks and describes in other treatises quite explicitly, treatises that are not translated into Latin. So he thinks that the heavenly bodies are incorruptible, not because they have a special matter, but because they have a special form. Whereas sublunary things are corruptible because they have forms that do not attach to matter infinitely or eternally. so they can be removed and replaced. However, here in the physics, which was translated into Latin, Avicenna weirdly and strangely says it is far-fetched that it is like this in light of what will become clear later. In Latin, immo postquam sic est. So I wondered what this means, because he seems to present his own position and then says, but that's not the case. Christina Cerami, in a private discussion once I had with her about this, had the wonderful idea that that Avicenna wants to criticize Al-Farabi's position here, which is different from his own position in only a detail. So that could explain why what he describes seems to be his own position, but he still says it's far-fetched. I have no answer to this yet, but yeah, it needs to get further research, I guess. But for Avicenna, then, matter is generically but not numerically common throughout the entire cosmos, but it's unclear to me whether this was understandable for a Latin reader. Because of this, precisely this sentence, cum ergo sic fuerit, immo postquam sic est, sicut postea apparibit, tunc erit hyle communis secundum hunc modum. So one question I would ask is there any reasonable way to understand immo postquam sic est as it is far-fetched that it is so, or if it was sort of understood by Latin readers differently, so that this could appear as if it was Avicenna's position, which, as said, weirdly, it actually is. So I don't understand what he meant with this far-fetched here. And it could be that if the Latin tradition didn't understand far-fetched, that they could still understand his actual position. So it's sort of a double negation that happens here. Yeah, other than that, there is one way I mentioned to you already to disprove numeric identity. If two things have a different origination, they cannot be numerically identical. So where does heavenly matter and sublunary matter come from? And on this question, Avicenna is a bit clearer, at least in works that were not translated into Latin. There he is super clear. He's a bit less clear in the translated texts. First, a wonderful passage from the last book of the Metaphysics, where he describes the procession and the return. He says that matter at one point, sublunary matter, commences. Yabtadi in Arabic, it begins. The Latin is a bit more straightforward because it speaks of incipit esse materiae. So it talks about esse of matter. In another text, text 10, he describes that at one point, a thing in which there is an imprint is sort of comes about, aliquid in quo est descriptio formarum, which is matter. So sublunary matter originates at one point, and he explains elsewhere that it originates from the active intellect, the last intellect. So there cannot be a single numerically one matter for the heavens and the earth, when the matter of the earth only later, in an essential meaning of later, originated, while the heavenly matters of the heavenly bodies were already existent. So there is no numerical identity, but there still can be a generic identity. Next topic, matter and its properties. Does matter have any properties? Well, yes and no, in a way. Yes, the yes answer is it has some, but albeit accidentally, qua being informed. But in and of itself, it does not have any, apart maybe from the receptivity of form. So it's fitting in text 11 that Avicenna argues against what he called the rather mystical talk of Aristotle, according to which the form is male while the matter is female, and thus the matter is craving for form. He argues against this, saying no, matter has no tendencies or activities in and of itself, apart from those that it has through the form. This, however, also means that in the eternal history of the world, there was never any prime matter that did not have properties through form, because the world is eternal, there always was matter, and matter was already informed. The reason in text 12 is precisely this. Matter, of course, does not subsist by itself, but it needs form. So it's always informed, otherwise it would actually cease to be. The same happens with bulk and volume and resistance of matter, or actually of body when we talk about interpenetration. So matter is not what prevents interpenetration of two bodies, as Philoponus had argued, but it's matter when it has a position through a certain form. And the discussion Avicenna provides here actually runs on the notion of position, which I think is quite interesting, that matter, of course, not through itself, but throughout eternity, every chunk of matter was located by being a certain natural thing. So it has a position. And this is also important if we transform water to air, the water form leaves the matter chunk and the air form comes in, and basically the air form needs to know where to go. So the matter has a position by being informed as one part of the entire cosmos. But of course, it doesn't have it by itself. It's an accidental property, but I think it's, in a way, it could be quite strongly ascribed to matter, but of course only via the form. But it's even when the form goes away and a new form comes in, the position is somehow relevant, so it stays. But of course, there's no time where the matter is not with form, so it doesn't. It's an immediate change from water to air. But I find this reference position quite interesting. Yeah. Next to volume, this is in text 14, Avicenna explains rarefaction and condensation in a way that matter can be unnaturally or forcefully be enlarged and compressed. Once this force stops, the matter jumps back. And this is how he explains all these vacuum phenomena, even without sort of adhering to the vacuum. Avicenna vehemently rejects the void, the vacuum, and he explains all these phenomena by matter, of course, an informed matter of a natural body being forcefully enlarged or compressed. But this all seems to mean that there may be a normal volume to matter, because there seems to be a natural state where it is not forcefully enlarged or compressed or rarefied and compressed. So there needs to be some kind of normal size of matter or normal volume of matter. We might ask us, is there a certain amount of matter in the world and this has a certain volume? So all the matter in the world has a certain size and it can be unforcefully enlarged or forcefully condensed. It does not grow. That's a related point. It does not grow. Matter cannot become more matter. As we just heard it, it can only be forcefully enlarged, but you don't have more matter. If you have addition of things, of course, you can put one drop of water to another drop of water and you get double the size of sort of a twice large drop of water. There can be increase through addition, but you cannot make more matter. So matter cannot grow. But this, again, it seems to mean that there is actually a certain amount of prime matter that exists in the world, in the entire cosmos. And my last section on potentiality, which is probably the topic we are most familiar with, and it's better known. Of course, he describes that matter precedes all originating things, and because the potentiality for origination must precede. But there's an important aspect that he takes up from Aristotle's Metaphysics Theta, of course, that potentiality cannot as such be prior, because actuality is prior. And his argument is, of course, that since matter cannot exist by itself, it's nothing it cannot have a certain preparedness for a form by itself. And it can only have a certain preparedness if it is informed by another form. So even the potentiality that for another form that matter has, even though it has it by itself, it needs to be prepared in the state where the matter is informed and so is a natural being. which is something that he explains a little later in another treatise on generation and corruption. It is always matter that is acted upon. And when fire heats the coldness of earth, for example, it does not enact the form of earth, it only enacts the matter of earth. So matter, of course, is informed and as part of a composite, but matter is the thing which is being acted upon and is somehow the bearer of all the qualities, of course, through the form. And the final point, which our dear friend John McGuinness has recently been working on a bit, is latitude. So in being acted upon, matter has certain degrees in which it still keeps holding onto a form, and it lets go of the form only once a certain limit has been exceeded. In Latin, we read here, quando transcendit de perditur completa dispositio quae est in materia ad illam formam. So that a new form comes to be in once we are outside of this boundary. I like this theory, but I always wondered how this works. So when water is not at all at once transformed into air but bit by bit, because if you cook water on your stove, it does not evaporate at once, but slowly, gradually after a while. And I think the answer is that Avicenna's giver of forms, who gives the forms into the matter, is actually very, very busy. And this is also, in fact, of division. Think of it. If division really is actually a generation rather than an accidental change, then whenever you rub something off from the surface of something, it's a case of division, and you need to constantly emanate forms to new beings. So for example, if you think of sawdust, when you saw with wood, you make it into two halves, but there's so many small particles of sawdust, they all would have to get their own form. So I guess Avicenna's giver of form is incredibly busy. And as a final word, maybe, of course, the complete preparedness that we find in the form is a state in the matter of the composite. So again, somehow the matter, by being informed, decides about the latitude and about when a certain preparedness for a new form is reached, so that it lets go of one form and receives another. So what is actually the thing that, or the bring home message that I wanted to convey? First, I collected a couple of passages from Avicenna's works which give information on what he thinks of form, such as, is it a substance, such as, does it exist at all, prime matter? How should we look at it? How is its relation to form? I collected these from also in the Latin translations, and I will, for the written version that will once come out under Nicola's guidance, will compare them more closely with the Arabic and draw out all the differences. Basically, I think most of what Avicenna wanted to say about matter was conveyed rather faithfully into Latin. There are some difference nonetheless, but what I like about Avicenna's conception of matter is this thing that maybe, especially about size, about its own volume and its behavior when it is informed, there may be some kind of, don't want to say qualities, but some kind of properties that pertain to matter if it is really something that exists in the world and acts as a part of the composite of natural bodies. So it needs to have a certain size, it needs to have some kind of a position, it needs to have decide somehow how it lets go of the form and takes on a new form. Of course, this is ultimately comes from the form that inheres in matter, and so it has it only accidentally, but for Avicenna, certainly prime matter is a real explanatory factor for the natural world. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. Thanks for Nicola, and also thank you for Peter for chairing the session.